The alarm did not sound like danger. It sounded like a soft chime, almost polite, and that was the first thing that struck me as wrong. I was standing on the observation deck of Outpost Cain Ver when the chime rang 3 times, and every officer around me went still. My name is Vesic Thor, and I have served the Dominion for 11 cycles. I have seen storms swallow ships whole. I have watched soldiers born on worlds where the ground itself tries to kill you before you take your first breath. I thought I understood danger. I did not yet understand humans. 3 days before that chime rang, I had been standing in the mess hall, laughing with my squad about the newest species led into our alliance. Humans. A species from a planet so mild, so forgiving, that their greatest danger was apparently something called weather. No crushing gravity. No poison air. No storms of glass and fire like the ones that shaped my own homeworld. Just soft blue skies and soft green fields, and a species that, by every measure we used to judge strength, should not have been able to survive a single cycle among the true Deathworld species of the galaxy. We called them the nursery species. Behind closed doors, and sometimes not so behind closed doors, we called them the soft ones. I remember a young officer named Talus Bren leaning back in his chair that day, grinning with his sharp lower teeth, telling a story he had heard from a trader. He said humans slept for 1/3 of their entire lives. He said they could not smell danger before it arrived, that their skin split open at the smallest cut, that they needed clothing just to survive a mild rain. He said their idea of hardship was going without a warm meal for 1 day. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. We had grown up on stories of true death worlds. My own homeworld, Kashel, had gravity strong enough to crush the bones of a lesser species, storms that stripped flesh from the careless, and predators that hunted in the dark, using senses no soft species could imagine. My cousins had faced beasts with venom that dissolved bone. My grandmother had survived a radiation storm by burying herself beneath stone for 6 days. That was what we believed made a species strong. That was what we believed had built us into what we were. Humans, by every account, had none of that. They had been handed an easy world, and now they were being handed a seat at our table simply because their ships had learned to fold space a little more efficiently than expected. Talus Bren finished his story by saying something that stuck with me longer than it should have. He said the only reason anyone feared humans at all was a rumor, a name traders whispered when they thought no one from the Dominion was listening. They called certain human soldiers the Boogeymen. It was, Talus said, clearly some soft creature's idea of a scary story, the kind you tell children to make them behave. He laughed again. I laughed with him. I did not know yet that laughter has a cost, and that the galaxy was about to collect it from me directly. 2 days after that conversation, word came down from command that our outpost would be running a joint exercise with a human unit. Not diplomats, not traders, soldiers. My squad received the news with groans and rolled eyes. We assumed we would be babysitting. I remember walking out to the landing pad with Talus Bren and our squad leader, a broad, scarred officer named Doran Key, all 3 of us expecting to greet nervous, chattering visitors who would need everything explained to them twice. The human shuttle landed without ceremony. No lights, no announcement, no fanfare. The ramp lowered in silence, and 8 humans walked out in a formation so tight and quiet that for a moment none of us spoke. They did not look soft. They did not look like children playing soldier. They looked like something coiled and waiting, the way a predator looks the instant before it decides you are not worth the effort of noticing. Their leader stepped forward first. Her name, she said, was Grace Doyle, and her voice was calm in a way that unsettled me more than shouting would have. She did not smile. She did not offer pleasantries. She simply extended a hand, the human gesture of greeting, and waited. Doran Kay shook it, clearly amused by the formality. He made some joke about hoping the humans had brought their own blankets for the cold nights on our outpost. Grace Doyle looked at him for a long moment, then said that where she came from, cold nights were not something you complained about. You simply survived them. It was such a small thing. A single sentence, but something about the way she said it, flat and unbothered, made the hair along my arms rise. I want to be honest about what happened over the following days, because I think honesty is the only thing that can make sense of what came after. We watched the human unit train, and slowly, quietly, the jokes in our barracks began to change shape. They trained before dawn, when the rest of the outpost was still resting. They trained again after their duties ended, when every other species on the base had already retired to their quarters. They did not train because an officer ordered them to. They trained because, as one young human soldier named Peter Marsh told me plainly, stopping felt wrong. I asked him why. He looked at me the way you might look at someone asking why you breathe. He said that on his world, humans had spent most of their history being hunted, not by machines, not by soldiers of another species, but by animals stronger and faster than any single human, animals with better eyes in the dark and sharper claws and no mercy at all. He said humans had survived that not by being the strongest creature on their world, but by being the most stubborn, the most adaptable, the most willing to keep going after every other option had failed. I remember laughing, gently, and telling him that surely those days were long behind his species now. Surely a world with soft blue skies and gentle weather did not need that kind of stubbornness anymore. He did not laugh back. He simply said that the danger changes, but the stubbornness never leaves. It just waits for something worth using it on. I filed that away as another odd human saying, the kind of thing soft creatures say to make themselves sound tougher than they are. I want to be honest that I still doubted him. Even after that conversation, even after watching them train past exhaustion, some old certainty in me refused to bend. Humans came from an easy world. Easy worlds did not make hard people. That was the rule I had been raised on, and rules like that do not fall easily. On the third night, during a live exercise meant to simulate a hostile boarding, I finally understood how wrong I truly was. The simulation was simple. A mock vessel had been rigged with pressure sensors and light charges to represent enemy fire. Our combined squad was meant to move through it in stages, clearing rooms, working as a unit, learning each other's rhythms before any real mission put us together. Doran Key went first with our Dominion soldiers, moving with the confidence of someone who had done this 100 times, calling out positions loudly, filling the corridor with noise and light from our sensor equipment. It was, by our standards, a fine performance, efficient, professional, exactly what the manual described. Then Grace Doyle's team moved. They did not fill the corridor with noise. They barely made a sound at all. I stood at the monitoring station beside two other Dominion officers, watching the internal cameras, and I remember all three of us going quiet at the same moment, because what we were watching did not look like training. It looked like something else entirely, something patient and precise, something that had clearly been practiced not for an exercise, but for a life where getting it wrong meant not getting another chance. Peter Marsh moved through a doorway, low and fast, checking corners with a kind of economy I had never seen from any species, wasting no motion, no sound, no hesitation. Behind him, a woman named Ellen Wade covered the space he had just cleared without needing to be told, the two of them moving like a single creature split into two bodies. When the simulated hostile charge, triggered near her position, meant to represent a strike that should have staggered her, she barely broke stride. She adjusted her weight, kept moving, and finished clearing the room before glancing down at the sensor reading on her suit that marked the hit. I asked her afterward, once the exercise had ended, why she had not stopped to acknowledge the strike immediately. She looked at the sensor mark on her sleeve, almost bored by it, and said that stopping in the middle of a job because something hurts is how you make sure everyone around you gets hurt worse. She said pain was information, not an instruction. You listened to it. You did not obey it. That night, back in my quarters, I lay awake longer than I had in cycles. I kept turning over Tallis Bren's joke in my mind, the one about the soft ones, who slept a third of their lives away, who could not smell danger, who needed clothing to survive gentle rain. I thought about the word boogeymen, the name traders whispered, as though it were nothing more than a story meant to frighten children. I did not yet understand that some stories are not meant to frighten children at all. Some stories exist because the adults who lived through the truth needed a gentler word to hand down to the next generation, a softer name for something they themselves still remembered with a kind of quiet, permanent respect. I did not sleep well that night. Something in me, some old instinct built for reading danger long before it arrives, had already begun to understand what my mind was still refusing to accept. I had spent my whole life believing that hardship was measured in gravity, in radiation, in the size and number of teeth a predator carried into the dark. I was about to learn that hardship can also be measured in the length of a memory, in the patience of a species that had once been prey and had quietly, stubbornly refused to stay that way. 3 days later, an emergency signal reached our outpost from a small farming colony 2 systems away, a distress call reporting an armed raid already in progress, hostages taken, and no clear way to reach the colony before the situation grew worse. Doran Key gathered both squads in the briefing room within minutes. I remember the mood in the room shifting the instant the coordinates appeared on the display. Dominion protocol called for careful assessment, for slow and deliberate planning, for gathering full intelligence before committing to any response. It was the doctrine I had trained under my entire career, the doctrine that had kept soldiers alive on 100 worlds by refusing to rush into danger blind. Grace Doyle did not wait for the doctrine to finish being explained. She looked at the coordinates, looked at the timestamp on the distress call, and said one sentence that I have not forgotten since. She said that every minute they spent planning was a minute someone on that colony was still afraid, and her team did not intend to let fear have any more minutes than it had already stolen. Then she turned to her squad, and without another word, all 8 of them were already moving toward the launch bay. I stood there for a moment, caught between the doctrine I had trusted my whole life and the sight of 8 humans walking toward danger as though it were simply the next item on an ordinary list of tasks. Doran Kay looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something on his face that was not amusement. It was uncertainty. I did not know it yet, standing in that briefing room, but the version of me that still believed hardship belonged only to Deathworlds was about to be left behind entirely. What came next would not be a lesson delivered in words. It would be delivered the only way humans ever seemed to teach anything that truly mattered, through action, through silence, and through a kind of quiet, terrible competence that no story, no matter how many times the traitors whispered the word Boogeymen, could have fully prepared me for. The shuttle ride to the colony took 11 hours, and I spent nearly every one of them watching the human squad instead of resting, because something in me needed to understand what I was looking at before we arrived. Doran Kay had assigned me to travel with Grace Doyle's team directly, partly to observe, partly because Command wanted a Dominion officer present for the joint response. I sat near the rear of the cabin, strapped into a jump seat, and studied 8 humans who behaved nothing like any soldiers I had served beside. There was no idle talk. There was no nervous energy, no restless movement, none of the small rituals I had seen Dominion soldiers perform before a mission to steady their nerves. Each human checked their equipment once, with a kind of calm thoroughness that suggested the check itself was almost unnecessary, a formality performed out of respect for the tools rather than fear of failure. A soldier named Daniel Cole sat across from me, cleaning a small blade with slow, careful strokes. I asked him if he was afraid. He looked up, considered the question seriously, the way I would later learn humans considered most honest questions, and said that fear was not something he tried to get rid of. He said fear was useful, it kept you alert. What he had learned to get rid of was the part of fear that made you hesitate when hesitation cost lives. I asked him where he had learned that. He said his grandmother taught him, long before he ever joined any military. She had survived what he called hard years in a place where danger came without warning and without mercy, and she had passed down one rule above all others. She told him that the moment you decide something is too frightening to face, you have already lost. The struggle itself often mattered less than the decision to keep standing in it. I did not fully understand the weight behind those words yet. I only knew that nothing about this conversation matched the soft, sheltered species Talus Bren had mocked in our mess hall. Grace Doyle spent most of the journey studying a projected map of the colony, updating it as fragments of new information arrived from the distress relay. She did this without visible urgency, without raising her voice, without demanding anyone move faster than the situation required. Yet somehow, by the time we reached orbit, her team had already built a complete plan, broken into stages, with contingencies for at least 4 different outcomes. Doran K., watching the same map from beside me, admitted quietly that Dominion doctrine would have called for a full tactical council before committing to any single plan, let alone 4. Grace Doyle overheard him. She said doctrine was written by people who had time to write it. She said colonies under attack did not offer that luxury, and a plan built quickly by people who trusted each other completely was often faster and safer than a perfect plan built slowly by people who did not. When we finally descended toward the colony, the first thing I noticed was the silence of the human squad's approach. Our Dominion shuttles typically announced themselves with running lights, identification beacons, and standard hailing signals, a proud display meant to project strength and authority. Grace Doyle's team requested we cut every visible signal the moment we entered the colony's outer atmosphere. Doran Key hesitated, citing protocol that required identification broadcasts during any approach to inhabited ground. Grace Doyle did not argue with him. She simply said that whoever was holding the colony almost certainly had scanners capable of reading those signals, and every second of warning we gave them was a second they could use to move hostages somewhere harder to reach. Doran Key authorized the blackout. I watched his hand hesitate over the console before he did it, and I understood, in that small hesitation, how much of what we were about to witness would challenge everything both of us had been trained to believe. We landed in a shallow valley 2 kilometers from the colony's outer wall, using the terrain to hide our approach. The ground here was rough, broken by jagged rock formations and thick clusters of dense vegetation, nothing like the smooth, engineered landing pads we were used to. I expected the human soldiers to struggle across it the way soft creatures might, slowed by unfamiliar footing, hesitant in the low visibility of the colony's long dusk. Instead, they moved across that broken ground faster than any of us, adjusting their steps instinctively to the uneven rock, reading the terrain the way a native creature reads its own territory. Ellen Wade later told me, when I asked how they managed it so easily, that difficult terrain was something humans had spent their entire history learning to survive. She said humans had crossed deserts with no water, forests thick enough to swallow sunlight, frozen lands where the air itself could threaten an unprepared traveler. She said a rocky valley on an unfamiliar planet was, to her, simply another version of a problem her species had already solved many times before. I began to understand, walking across that valley in the dark, that the story I had been told about humanity was not simply exaggerated, it was inverted entirely. Their world had not been easy. It had been demanding in ways so old and so deeply survived that the difficulty had stopped looking like difficulty to them at all. It had become instinct. As we approached the outer wall of the colony, Grace Doyle raised a closed fist, and every human behind her stopped instantly, without a sound, without a single misplaced footstep. I nearly walked into Daniel Cole before I noticed the signal myself. He caught my arm gently, steadying me, and pointed toward a ridge above us where, once my eyes adjusted, I could make out the faint outline of a lookout stationed at the wall. Doran Key, beside me, reached for his comm device out of habit, intending to relay the sighting to the rest of our combined force. Grace Doyle stopped him with a small gesture before he could activate it. She mouthed a single word, "Not yet." We waited there, motionless, for what felt like an unbearably long stretch of time, though I later learned it had been only a few minutes. The human squad did not fidget. They did not check their equipment again. They simply watched, patient in a way that felt almost unnatural, until the lookout above shifted position and briefly turned away. The moment his attention moved elsewhere, 2 human soldiers advanced. I will not describe every detail of what followed, only that it was resolved in seconds, conducted with a controlled economy that left the lookout unable to raise any alarm, and the path to the outer wall was clear before Doran Key had even finished processing what he had just watched happen in front of him. I turned to Grace Doyle, and I asked her, quietly, how her team had learned to move like that, with such total control, such complete absence of hesitation. She said something then that I would carry with me long after that mission ended. She said humans had spent most of their history as prey before they ever became anything else. Long before cities, long before machines, long before any of the comforts my own species associated with an easy world, humans had lived in small groups, threatened by creatures stronger and faster than any single human alone. She said the ones who survived long enough to have descendants were the ones who learned patience, who learned to move without sound, who learned that hesitation in the dark often meant not surviving the night. She said that instinct never fully leaves a species, no matter how comfortable their world eventually becomes. It waits, quiet and unused, until something calls it back. I asked her if that unsettled her, carrying something like that inside her every day. She looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had met her, something close to a smile crossed her face, though it held no real warmth in it. She said it did not unsettle her at all. She said it was the only reason her species had ever made it this far, and she was grateful for it every single day, even on the days she wished it would let her rest. At the base of the outer wall, Grace Doyle knelt and pressed her palm flat against the stone, studying something I could not see, before signaling her team forward in a formation so tight and deliberate it looked almost choreographed. Doran Kay leaned toward me and whispered that he had never seen anything like this in 11 cycles of service, not from any species we had ever worked alongside. I told him I had not either. I did not tell him what else I was beginning to feel, because I did not yet have the words for it. It was not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. It was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of a much larger truth than the one I had been raised to believe, a truth that had been hiding in plain sight behind soft blue skies and gentle weather, and a species everyone assumed had never needed to struggle for anything at all. The colony wall rose in front of us, dark and quiet, hiding whatever waited on the other side. Grace Doyle glanced back at her team one final time, checking each face without a word, the way a parent might check on sleeping children before leaving a room. Then she turned toward the wall, raised 2 fingers, and gave the signal to move. Whatever certainty I had walked into that valley with was gone by the time we reached that wall. What replaced it was something far more unsettling, a growing awareness that the galaxy had spent generations laughing at a species it had never actually understood, and that the real lesson of that mistake was about to be delivered in full, on the other side of a colony wall, in the dark, in silence, by people who had learned long ago that the only thing more dangerous than a true Deathworld creature was a species that had survived being hunted by one and simply refused to forget how. Inside the wall, the colony looked nothing like the peaceful farming settlement described in the earliest reports. Buildings that should have held families and grain stores instead held armed figures posted at doorways and rooftops, their attention split between watching the perimeter and watching each other, the nervous energy of raiders who had taken more than they knew how to hold. Grace Doyle's team split into 2 elements the moment we crossed the threshold, moving with a fluid coordination that required no spoken commands. I stayed close to Daniel Cole, who had been assigned to keep me within his sightline, a decision I did not argue with once I understood how little I actually knew about operating in an environment like this. The first structure we approached held a storage building converted into a holding area, according to a hurried transmission relayed from a colonist who had managed to hide a small communicator. Grace Doyle received the update through her earpiece without breaking stride, translating the information into a plan so quickly that Doran Kay, moving just behind her with the remainder of our combined force, could barely keep pace with the pivot. Doran Kay asked, in a low voice, whether we should wait for confirmation on the number of hostiles inside before committing. Grace Doyle answered without turning her head. She said waiting for perfect confirmation was a luxury bought with other people's time, and the people locked inside that building had already spent enough of it being afraid. We moved. I will describe what happened next as clearly as I can, though even now, retelling it, I find myself searching for words that do justice to what I witnessed. The Dominion soldiers among us, myself included, had trained for encounters like this using careful, layered protocols, methods built to minimize risk through overwhelming caution. What the human team did instead was not reckless. It was something else entirely, a kind of controlled, deliberate speed that made caution and risk feel like the wrong categories altogether. Peter Marsh reached the storage building first, pressing himself flat against the wall beside its single entrance, listening for a count of perhaps 3 seconds before signaling the rest of the team forward. Ellen Wade moved in behind him, low and silent, while Daniel Cole guided me to a covered position a short distance away, close enough to observe, far enough to stay out of the path of whatever was about to happen. The door opened, and for a brief moment, the interior of the building was lit only by dim emergency lighting, casting long shadows across huddled shapes near the back wall. I could make out perhaps a dozen colonists, bound and seated, several of them young, all of them clearly frightened. 2 armed figures stood near the entrance, caught in the instant between recognizing intrusion and reacting to it. What followed took less time than it takes to describe. Peter Marsh and Ellen Wade moved through that doorway together, closing the distance to the 2 armed figures before either could raise an alarm, resolving the encounter with a swift, controlled certainty that left the hostages unharmed and the situation contained within seconds. There was no hesitation in either of them, no wasted movement, no moment where either soldier paused to consider a different choice. It was over, almost before I had finished processing that it had begun. Grace Doyle entered immediately after, kneeling beside the nearest colonist, a young woman shaking uncontrollably, and spoke to her in a voice so gentle it seemed to belong to an entirely different person than the one who had given the order to move only moments earlier. She told the woman she was safe now, that the danger in that room was finished, and that more of her people were coming to help the rest of the colony. I remember standing in that doorway, watching Grace Doyle work through the bindings on the hostages with careful, patient hands, and understanding for the first time that the same species capable of the speed and precision I had just witnessed was equally capable of this, a tenderness that felt just as deliberate, just as practiced, as everything that had come before it. It was not a contradiction. It was the same discipline, aimed in 2 different directions depending on what the moment required. Door and Key moved to help secure the freed hostages, directing our Dominion soldiers to escort them toward a defensible position near the outer wall. I stayed with Grace Doyle's team as they pushed further into the colony, toward the central structure where the remaining raiders had reportedly gathered their leadership and the last of their captives. It was there that the mission took a harder turn. A defensive position had been established around the central structure, raiders using overturned equipment and reinforced barriers to control the approach. Grace Doyle's team paused at the edge of a narrow street, studying the layout through a small scanning device that projected a rough outline of the defenses onto her forearm display. She turned to her team and laid out the plan in a handful of clipped sentences, assigning each soldier a role without needing to repeat herself. I noticed, watching her do this, that no one asked a single clarifying question. They simply nodded, checked their positions, and moved. The approach to the central structure required crossing an open stretch of ground with limited cover, a stretch that the raiders had clearly anticipated defending. Grace Doyle chose to lead the crossing herself, a decision Doran Kay quietly objected to, arguing that a squad leader should direct from a protected position rather than expose herself first. Grace Doyle's answer was simple. She said her team would not ask anyone to cross ground she was unwilling to cross herself. The crossing began, and this is the part of the mission I have relived most often since, because it was here that I finally understood, beyond any doubt, why traitors whispered the word Boogeymen when they spoke of certain human soldiers. Resistance came quickly, raiders reacting to the approaching squad with defensive fire from the barricades ahead. What struck me most was not the response itself, which I had expected, but the complete absence of panic in the humans moving through it. Grace Doyle called adjustments calmly, her voice never rising, directing her team through the open ground using whatever fragments of cover the terrain offered, closing the distance with a controlled urgency that felt less like recklessness and more like inevitability. Daniel Cole, moving near the front of the formation, took a solid impact partway through the crossing, the kind of hit that would have ended the advance of any Dominion soldier I had ever served beside. He staggered, caught himself, and kept moving, closing the remaining distance to cover before acknowledging the injury at all. He said the moment you decide an injury is the end of your usefulness, it becomes exactly that. He said pain was loud, but it was not always honest about how much it was actually costing you, and the only way to find out the truth was to keep functioning until the job was finished and then let yourself feel the full weight of it afterward. I did not fully understand that philosophy until I watched him apply it in front of me, refusing to let something that should have ended his participation in the mission become anything more than a detail to address once the true priority, the safety of the remaining hostages, had been secured. The final approach to the central structure came down to a narrow corridor formed between two collapsed sections of wall, the only remaining path forward once the open ground had been crossed. Grace Doyle's team moved through it in a tight formation, each soldier covering a different angle, closing on the last defensive position with a speed that gave the remaining raiders almost no opportunity to organize a coordinated response. I watched Peter Marsh and Ellen Wade work through that final stretch together, moving with the same silent coordination I had first noticed during the training exercise days earlier, except now there was nothing simulated about it. Every motion carried the full weight of consequence, and still neither of them hesitated, still neither of them wasted a single unnecessary movement. The resolution came quickly once the team breached the final position. The Raider leadership, faced with a squad that had already dismantled every defensive line they had prepared, chose to surrender rather than continue resisting. Grace Doyle accepted the surrender without any visible satisfaction, without the kind of triumphant posturing I might have expected from a Dominion unit after a successful engagement. She simply moved through the process methodically, securing the area, confirming the safety of the last remaining hostages, and calling in the update to Doran K's position at the outer wall. I remember standing near the entrance of that central structure once the situation had stabilized, watching colonists reunite with each other in the aftermath, some crying, some simply sitting in stunned silence, processing what they had survived. Grace Doyle moved among them quietly, checking on the injured, coordinating with our medical personnel who had finally been able to move up from the landing site, never once acting as though what she had just done was remarkable. Doran Key found me there, a short while later, standing apart from the activity, still trying to organize everything I had witnessed into something my mind could accept. He asked me what I thought of the humans now, after everything we had seen. I did not have a clean answer for him. I told him that I no longer believed the story I had been raised on, the one that measured a species' strength by the harshness of its homeworld alone. I told him that whatever had shaped humanity, it had clearly gone far deeper than soft blue skies and gentle weather ever suggested, and that I suspected we had been measuring the wrong things entirely, judging a species by the surface of their world rather than the full weight of what they had survived to reach it. Doran K did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward Grace Doyle, still moving quietly among the freed colonists, offering steady reassurance to people who, only hours earlier, had believed they might not survive the day at all. Later, once the colony had been secured and the last of the raiders had been placed under guard, I found Daniel Cole sitting alone near the outer wall, finally allowing a medic to properly examine the injury he had carried through the entire final approach without complaint. I sat down beside him, still turning over everything I had witnessed, and I asked him the question that had been building in me since the moment Grace Doyle's shuttle first touched down at our outpost days earlier. I asked him why other species called his kind the Boogeymen. He looked at me for a long moment, the same steady, unhurried expression he had carried through every stage of the mission, and he told me that if I truly wanted to understand the answer, it was not something that could be explained quickly, standing at the edge of a battlefield with the aftermath still settling around us. He said it was a longer story, one that stretched back further than any single mission could capture, and he offered to tell it properly once we were somewhere quieter, somewhere the story could be given the space it deserved. I agreed without hesitation. I had spent days doubting everything I thought I understood about his species, and I was no longer willing to let that doubt go unanswered. We spoke that evening in a quiet corner of the colony's shared hall, once the wounded had been treated and the freed colonists had begun the slow work of rebuilding some sense of normal life. Daniel Cole sat across from me with a warm cup of something the colonists had offered him, his injury bandaged and finally at rest, and he began the story he had promised me earlier, at the edge of the battlefield. He told me that to understand why other species whispered the word boogeymen when they spoke of certain human soldiers, I first needed to understand something about the true history of his world, a history that had almost nothing to do with the soft blue skies and gentle weather that outsiders always noticed first. He said that long before humans built cities, long before they learned to shape metal or harness fire reliably, they lived in small, vulnerable groups, scattered across a world filled with predators far stronger and faster than any single human alone could hope to match. Creatures with better night vision, sharper senses, greater speed, and none of the moral hesitation that might have offered humanity any mercy. He said humans survived that period not because they were the strongest creature on their world, but because they learned to work together in ways few other species managed, sharing knowledge across generations, adapting faster than their bodies alone ever could have allowed. They learned patience. They learned to read the smallest signs of danger long before it arrived. They learned that surviving the night sometimes meant staying utterly silent for hours, waiting for a threat to lose interest and move on. He said that fear, in those early years, was not a weakness to overcome. It was simply the truth of their situation, honestly acknowledged, and the humans who survived long enough to raise children were the ones who had learned to use that fear as fuel rather than let it freeze them in place. Over countless generations, he explained, that same instinct did not disappear once humans began to build their own defenses, once they began to master fire and tools and the earliest forms of shelter. It simply changed shape. Humans stopped being prey to the creatures that had once hunted them, and in the long stretch of history that followed, they turned much of that same hard-earned discipline toward each other, building societies, and inevitably, building conflicts between those societies as resources grew scarce and ambitions grew large. He spoke carefully here, choosing his words with visible deliberation, and told me that human history held long periods where groups of humans faced each other in prolonged, difficult struggles, testing every part of the discipline their ancestors had first developed simply to survive the night. He said it was not something his species was proud of, in the way the traitors' rumors sometimes implied, as though violence itself was some kind of trophy. It was simply the honest truth of how thoroughly that ancient survival instinct had been carried forward, refined instead of forgotten, generation after generation, long after the original predators that shaped it had stopped being the primary danger at all. He told me that the particular soldiers other species had begun calling the Boogeymen were not simply the strongest or the most aggressive among humanity. They were, more often, the ones who had spent the most time deliberately studying that inherited discipline, training themselves in patience, in quiet movement, in the ability to remain calm through circumstances that would overwhelm someone who had not prepared for them. He said many of them came from a particular tradition within human military history, one built specifically around operating in small, self-reliant groups, often at night, often in situations where waiting for larger support was not an option. He said the name itself had never come from humans boasting about themselves. It had come from other species, from accounts passed between traders and mercenaries who had crossed paths with these soldiers during difficult encounters, struggling to describe an experience that unsettled them in ways they could not fully articulate. He said the word boogeyman, in human folklore, referred to an old, half-remembered fear told to children, a shadowy figure that existed at the edge of imagination rather than in any confirmed, tangible form. He said it was, in a strange way, an appropriate name, because these soldiers had learned to move through the world the same way that old fear moved through a child's imagination, present, unseen, and unsettling, precisely because you could never be certain exactly where they were or what they were capable of until the moment arrived. I asked him if it bothered him, carrying a name built from other people's fear rather than admiration. He considered the question longer than I expected before answering. He said it did not bother him, because the fear itself was never really about cruelty. It was about uncertainty, about facing an opponent whose calm, controlled competence made every assumption you carried into a conflict suddenly feel unreliable. He said most species measured danger by size, by strength, by the number and sharpness of teeth a creature carried. Humans, he said, had learned a different measure entirely, one built on patience, adaptability, and the refusal to stop functioning simply because a situation had become difficult. He told me a story then, one his own instructor had told him early in his training, about a soldier from generations earlier who had once tracked a target alone across difficult terrain for 4 days without proper rest, relying on nothing but discipline and the same ancient patience his ancestors had once used to survive being hunted themselves. He said the story had been passed down not because it was unusual among his people, but because it illustrated something ordinary within their tradition, a baseline expectation rather than an extraordinary exception. I told him honestly that where I came from, endurance like that was associated only with true Deathworld species, creatures shaped directly by hostile environments, crushing gravity, or predators far larger than themselves. I told him I had spent most of my life believing that humanity, coming from such a mild and forgiving world, could not possibly carry that same kind of hard-earned resilience. He listened to me without offense, and then he said something that reshaped how I understood the entire concept of a death world from that point forward. He said that danger was not only measured in gravity, or radiation, or the size of a planet's predators. He said the deepest danger a species could face was often quieter than that, stretched across a much longer span of time, built from scarcity, from competition, from the sheer difficulty of surviving alongside other members of your own species who wanted the same limited resources you did. He said Earth's mild weather and comfortable climate had never been the whole story. It had simply been the surface, and beneath that surface lay a much older, much harder history that most outsiders never bothered to look for, because it was easier to judge a world by its skies than by the true weight of what its people had survived to reach the present day. I sat with that for a long while, turning it over in my mind, comparing it against everything I had believed about deathworlds and the species they produced. My own homeworld had shaped me through obvious, immediate danger, gravity that could crush bone, storms that could strip flesh, predators built with senses no soft species could match. It was a kind of danger easy to see, easy to measure, easy to respect at a glance. What Daniel Cole was describing was something else entirely, a danger built slowly across countless generations, hidden behind gentle skies and comfortable climates, invisible to anyone who judged a species only by the surface of their world. It occurred to me, sitting there in that quiet hall, that this hidden kind of hardship might be more dangerous precisely because it was so easy to overlook, allowing outsiders like myself to walk into an encounter with humans carrying every wrong assumption imaginable, exactly as I had. I asked him, finally, if he resented the mockery his species had endured from others, the jokes about softness, about needing clothing to survive gentle rain, about sleeping away a third of their lives. He shook his head slowly and told me that mockery, built on ignorance, rarely lasted long once it met the truth directly. He said his people had faced worse judgments before, from within their own history, and had never needed outside approval to know exactly what they were capable of. He said the only thing that mattered to him was that the colonists we had freed that day would sleep safely tonight, and that the rest of the galaxy's opinion, whether built on mockery or respect, mattered far less than that simple outcome. I left that conversation with something in me fundamentally changed. The contempt I had carried into this assignment, the easy laughter I had shared with Talus Bren over jokes about soft, sheltered humans, felt impossibly distant now, replaced by something closer to a quiet, sober respect, tangled together with an honest thread of unease that I suspected would never fully leave me. I understood, finally, why the word boogeymen had traveled so far across the galaxy, whispered among traders who had crossed paths with soldiers like Daniel Cole and Grace Doyle and the rest of their quiet, disciplined team. It was not a story meant to frighten children. It was the closest word available to describe an experience that defied easy explanation, the discomfort of watching a species everyone had underestimated reveal, calmly and without any need for validation, exactly how deep their history truly ran. We returned to Outpost Canver 3 days later, the joint mission officially recorded as a full success, every hostage recovered, every colonist accounted for, and remarkably few casualties among our combined force, a fact that Doran Key pointed out more than once during our debrief, always with the same note of quiet disbelief in his voice. Word of what had happened at the colony spread through the outpost faster than any official report could travel. By the time our shuttle had fully docked, small groups of Dominion soldiers were already gathering near the landing bay, watching Grace Doyle's team disembark with an attention that had nothing to do with mockery anymore. I noticed Talus Bren standing near the back of one such group, arms crossed, his usual easy grin nowhere in sight. He caught my eye briefly as I stepped off the shuttle, and something passed between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that the version of him who had told those jokes in the mess hall a week earlier belonged to a version of understanding neither of us fully believed in anymore. I did not go out of my way to embarrass him over it. I understood too well how easily I had shared in that same laughter, how confidently I had accepted a story about humanity built entirely on surface impressions rather than any real understanding of what lay beneath. It would have been easy to feel superior now, having witnessed the truth firsthand, but the truth itself did not leave much room for superiority. It left room only for a quieter, more honest kind of respect, the kind that comes from having your assumptions dismantled piece by piece until nothing remains but the evidence in front of you. Doran Key requested a formal review of our engagement protocols in the days that followed, citing the mission at the colony as clear evidence that our existing doctrine, built around slow, methodical caution, needed serious reconsideration when working alongside human units. I sat in on several of those discussions, listening to senior officers debate the merits of adapting our approach, some resistant to the idea that a species so recently introduced to galactic society could have anything meaningful to teach a force, with our long and storied history of encountering hostile worlds. I found myself, more than once, speaking up in those meetings in ways I would not have imagined myself doing only weeks earlier. I described what I had witnessed at the colony in careful detail, the silent approach across difficult terrain, the controlled precision at each stage of the engagement, the calm way Daniel Cole had continued functioning through an injury that should have ended his participation entirely. I described Grace Doyle's insistence on speed over excessive caution, not as recklessness, but as a different kind of discipline built around minimizing the time fear was allowed to control a situation. One of the more senior officers present, a veteran named Alan Voss, who had served considerably longer than I had, asked me directly whether I believed humans deserved reclassification within our understanding of Deathworld species, given everything I had observed. It was not a simple question, and I did not offer a simple answer. I told him that our existing system measured death worlds through visible, immediate danger: gravity, radiation, hostile atmospheres, aggressive predators, the kind of hardship that could be quantified through instruments and observed from orbit. I told him that humanity's history did not fit neatly into that framework, because the hardship that shaped them was not written into the geology or atmosphere of their world at all. It was written into the long, difficult span of their history, generations of scarcity, competition, and struggle that left no visible trace on the planet itself, but had clearly left a permanent trace on the species that survived it. I suggested, somewhat carefully, that perhaps our classification system needed an entirely new category, one that measured not the environment a species emerged from, but the resilience that environment had produced, regardless of how mild that environment appeared on the surface. Alan Voss considered this for a long moment before admitting that such a category would require rethinking assumptions that had guided Dominion doctrine for longer than either of us had been alive. I did not expect that suggestion to change anything immediately, and it did not. Bureaucracies move slowly, and old assumptions rarely surrender easily, even in the face of direct evidence. But I noticed, in the weeks that followed, a subtle shift in how our soldiers spoke about human units. The old jokes did not vanish overnight, but they grew quieter, less frequent, replaced gradually by a kind of cautious curiosity that had not existed before the mission at the colony. I spent much of that time continuing to work alongside Grace Doyle's team, partly through official assignment, partly because I found myself genuinely wanting to understand more about the species I had so thoroughly misjudged. I learned that human history was not a single uniform story of struggle, but a vast collection of different peoples, different traditions, different ways of surviving and adapting across a world far more varied than I had ever appreciated. I learned that Grace Doyle's own family carried stories from a tradition of quiet endurance passed down through generations of people who had faced hardship without ever losing their sense of purpose. I learned that Peter Marsh's grandmother had crossed difficult terrain on foot as a young woman, carrying nothing but the barest essentials, teaching him early that comfort was something you earned through preparation rather than something owed to you simply for existing. Ellen Wade, during one quiet evening at the outpost, told me something that stayed with me long after our conversation ended. She said that humans had never needed a hostile planet to become who they were, because they had learned, across countless generations, to carry the hardship within themselves rather than depend entirely on their environment to shape them. She said that was, in some ways, a more dangerous kind of resilience than anything built purely from external pressure, because it meant humans could adapt to almost any environment, hostile or gentle, and remain fundamentally the same underneath, patient, capable, and quietly prepared for whatever came next. I thought often, during those weeks, about the earlier version of myself who had laughed so easily at Tallis Bren's jokes in the mess hall, who had accepted without question the idea that a mild homeworld could only produce a mild species. I understood now how thoroughly that assumption had blinded an entire galactic community to the true nature of the species standing among us, a mistake built not from malice, but from the simple, understandable habit of judging a book by nothing more than the softness of its cover. Roughly a month after the mission at the colony, Doran Key arranged a smaller, informal gathering at the outpost to properly thank Grace Doyle's team for their role in the operation, a gesture that felt necessary given how casually their presence had first been received. Officers who had once dismissed human soldiers with quiet condescension now approached the gathering with genuine respect, some openly admitting how wrong their earlier assumptions had been. I found myself standing near the edge of that gathering with Daniel Cole, both of us watching the quiet, easy way his teammates interacted with officers who, only weeks earlier, would have barely acknowledged their presence at all. I asked him if it felt strange, watching that shift happen so quickly, watching an entire outpost's opinion of his species change within the span of a single mission. He said it did not feel particularly strange to him, because his people had experienced this pattern many times throughout their own history, being underestimated by others until circumstances forced a re-evaluation. He said the important lesson, the one his own grandmother had tried to teach him long before he ever left his homeworld, was never to let outside opinion, positive or negative, change how seriously you took your own responsibilities. He said the respect of others was a pleasant thing to receive, but it was never something worth chasing, because the moment you needed it to feel capable, you had already given away something more valuable than any single mission's outcome. I asked him, near the end of that gathering, whether he thought other species across the galaxy would eventually come to understand humanity the way I now did, or whether the old jokes about softness and easy worlds would simply continue elsewhere, unaffected by what had happened at this single colony. He considered the question honestly, without any need to offer a comforting answer, simply because it was easier. He said some species would likely take much longer to understand, perhaps requiring their own version of the lesson I had just learned, delivered through their own direct experience rather than second-hand accounts. He said others might never fully understand at all, content to keep judging worlds by their skies rather than the history carried by the people who survived beneath them. He said that did not particularly worry him, because humanity had never needed universal understanding to remain exactly who they were. What mattered, he said, was that the people who did work alongside them, who did take the time to look past the surface, came away with an accurate picture rather than a mocking one, and that the colonists on that farming world would carry forward an honest memory of what had actually happened, rather than the exaggerated rumors that traders sometimes spread in either direction. I left that gathering that evening, walking back toward my quarters under an unfamiliar sky, thinking about how completely my understanding of strength and hardship had been reshaped in the span of a single joint assignment. I thought about my own homeworld, about the storms and gravity and predators that had shaped my people across countless generations, and I understood now that this had never been the only path toward genuine resilience. It had simply been the version I had been raised to recognize, the version easiest to measure from orbit, the version that fit neatly into a classification system built long before anyone in the Dominion had ever properly studied a species like humanity. The true measure, I had come to understand, ran deeper than any single planet's environment could explain on its own. It lived instead in the quiet discipline of a soldier who kept moving after an injury that should have stopped him, in the patient stillness of a squad willing to wait in silence for the exact right moment to act, in the steady, unhurried kindness a leader like Grace Doyle could offer a frightened colonist only moments after demonstrating a level of controlled precision that had left an entire outpost of hardened Dominion soldiers speechless. I never heard Talus Bren tell another joke about soft, sheltered humans after that mission. I did not need to ask him why. I understood completely, because I had lived through the same quiet, permanent shift myself, standing at the edge of a colony wall in the dark, watching a species I had once dismissed prove, without a single word of complaint or self-congratulation, exactly why other worlds across the galaxy had learned, long before I ever did, to lower their voices and choose their words carefully whenever the conversation turned toward the quiet, patient soldiers that everyone still called the Boogeymen. The galaxy had spent generations ridiculing a world it never truly understood, mistaking gentle skies for an easy history and mild weather for an untested people. It took witnessing the truth firsthand, standing beside soldiers who moved through danger with the same calm patience their ancestors had once used simply to survive the night, for that ridicule to finally fall silent, replaced by something far more lasting, a respect earned not through boasting or spectacle, but through quiet, consistent action, delivered exactly when it mattered most, by the very people the galaxy had once dismissed as too soft to matter at all.